Today I'm going to explain to you guys how the wealth is so terribly distributed in America with the help of these little army men and a little graph. And I'm going to prove how our brilliant so-called free democratic society is actually not very different from those tyrannical societies in the ancient Egypt pharaohs era or the kings and queens in Europe. Stick around.
They want to make an opinion on you. Fight. Resist. Be free as God wants you to be.
So as you can see, I have 1,000 of these army men, which represents the entire population of the United States, which is 323 million people. So every army man represents 0.1% of the population, or which is the same 323,000 people. I also have these little houses, which represents the American wealth. So because I have 100 houses, every house represents 1% of the American wealth. So I have the entire population aligned in rows of 10. So every row I'm gonna call family, and there's 100 families here. So each row or family represents 1% of the American population. Now, if America was a totally egalitarian society, which means that every citizen owns the same amount of wealth, this is what you would see. Every family owning a house. Nobody owns more than anybody else. However, United States is not this kind of society, because we will be called communist, right? And we're capitalist. And as we all know, capitalism is a better system, which history has taught us so far. So that means that some people will have more than others, which is fine if it's controlled within some boundaries. However, what we're seeing today is some disrupting numbers. I'm gonna show you how. So I'm gonna start from the richest to the poorest one. So this first row are the richest 1% of America. So because they're the richest ones, they don't own just a house. They own 42 houses. So obviously, logically, I'm gonna take the 42 houses, the extra 41 houses, from the poorest one to give them to the richest one. However, this family is so rich that they have their own inequality numbers. Actually, the richest guy in this family owns more than half of the wealth of the entire family, which is 22 houses. So this is like 42 houses. I'm gonna take one from the family and give it to the richest guy of this family, which is here. Only this guy owns 22 houses, and the rest of the family owns 20. Now I'm gonna go with the next 4 richest families, which are these over here. They don't own 4 houses in total. They own 23 houses, which means that in average, each one owns 6 houses. Okay, now I'm gonna go on with the next 5 richest families, which are all these. Now they don't own 5 houses, they actually own 12 houses, which means that in average they own between 3 or 2 houses. Okay, so now we're going with the next 10 richest families, which are all these here. Now they own 11 houses, which practically in average is like every family owning 1 house, with the exception of the richest one, which is right here. The rest of them owns only 1 house. And after that, we can't just explain too much, because we start running out of wealth or houses. And you have like multiple families owning only 1 house. They're sharing 1 house. And this is how it started looking. So as you can see here, the richest guy in this representation of America, which is my red guy right here, owns the same amount of wealth or houses than the poorest 900 people in this representation, which is 90% of the population. And we're talking about my gray and my green friends all together. They all together, 900 people, own the same amount than the single rich people in this representation. Other thing that you can appreciate in this representation is that the poorest 500 people, or the poorest 50%, only survives with one house. That's how poor they are. Now, I have put these numbers together in a graph so you can appreciate a few more things, like the slope of the concentration of wealth curve. So I have put the same numbers together in this graph, and we have wealth in the vertical axis and we have population in the horizontal axis. As you can see, in the wealth we have the case of negative wealth because of the banking system, and we have the actually net 100% of the wealth. And in the population, well, we can have negative population, so it starts from 0 to 100%. As you can see, these are people who have more debt than actual goods, so their net wealth is actually negative, and this is a very large percentage. And then a large population has just a little bit of wealth. They have a positive wealth though. This is another 25% of the Americans. And as you can see in this first 80%, 8 out of 10 Americans are either extremely poor, lower middle class, or middle class people. And the slope of the curve is very small, which means that there is not a big disparity in the wealth that people in this first 80% own. So the wealth that they have changes very slightly while you move up or down in this curve. Then the upper middle class, which is only 10% of the population, is a real change, since the curve migrates from being slightly steep to greatly steep, as we can see here. In average, 1% of the population in the upper middle class people owns 1% of the American wealth. This means that actually, if United States migrates to an egalitarian society right now, everybody will live like an upper middle class person. Now, then the problem is that after this, the curve is very, very steep, and the problem starts when you reach the richest 1%. Once you get to the 1%, the concentration of wealth is really crazy. The 0.1%, these people right here, they own the same amount of wealth than the poorest 90%. What is even more incredible is the 0.01%. They own the same amount than the poorest 80%. So the richest 32,310 Americans own the same amount than the poorest 258 million. This is like the real problem right here. The problem is not the richest 1%. It is not. It starts being the 0.1% and up, which is the 0.01, and you can just go on and go on and go on. Now, some of you may argue that, well, the 0.1% earned it, right? But the problem is how they earned it. They basically cheat the system every day. They manipulate our democracy every day. They're capable of anything to extract the most amount of wealth that they can out of the bottom 90% of the population. This actually poses a very dangerous threat to the checks and balances in our democracy. And this hasn't been always like this, you know? Here are some historic facts about this topic. In the 20s, a very similar scenario took place, as you can see in this graph. And we all know what happened in the 20s, right? The Great Depression. Only programs brought by the President Franklin Roosevelt in the New Deal was able to change this trend. And a long phase of prosperity and evenly distributed wealth was enjoyed by every American for about 50 years. The 70s, however, is when the game changed. Large corporations started to join forces to acquire more wealth. And you can see things as the Powell Memorandum as a clear example of the path that the nation will follow for the next decades until the present. Lobbyists started to proliferate in Washington, and after this, regulations, laws, budgets, policies, even Supreme Court decisions started to favor large corporation sides. And this is how, little by little, common people like you and me started losing their voice in the Capitol and in the White House. Today, you can see how decades of brainwash have caused so much damage in people's brains that they think that a billionaire trickster is gonna look after common people's interests. If you're not part of the richest 1%, and if you still support Trump today after this tremendous disaster that his presidency has been, you have a severe brain damage. You have to visit a doctor immediately. As you can see, I have proved that our social pyramid in America nowadays is not very different from those tyrannical ancient Egypt societies or kings and queens in Europe, which really undermines the concept of democracy in America. It is our responsibility, though, you and me, to do whatever is in our hands to stop this. Read, educate yourself, tell your friends, speak up, fight for your rights, share, like and subscribe. Thank you.